The job of an M60 machine gunner in Vietnam was among the most terrifying, grueling, and hazardous roles a soldier could have during the war. The M60, a 7.62mm belt-fed machine gun, weighed around 23 pounds, and when combined with the vast amounts of ammunition a gunner had to carry, often hundreds of rounds, this made for an exhausting load that would wear down even the fittest soldiers. The gun itself, though powerful and effective in suppressing enemy positions, was cumbersome and difficult to maneuver through the dense, treacherous terrain of Vietnam. The soldiers carrying the M60 not only had to bear the weight of the weapon, but also the heavy burden of keeping it operational in extreme conditions. The humid, swampy jungles of Vietnam were a nightmare for any soldier, but for the M60 gunners, they were especially perilous. The dense foliage and shifting, wet ground often meant they could not move easily or quickly. The gun could easily get stuck in the mud or jam from dirt and moisture, requiring constant maintenance. Despite these difficulties, the gunners were responsible for keeping up an unrelenting stream of suppressive fire, which meant they were frequently in the thick of the most intense, dangerous combat. The role of the M60 gunner was always one of high risk. Often they were positioned in forward, exposed locations where they could provide the most effective suppressive fire. This made them prime targets for enemy forces. The sound of the M60 firing could often reveal a soldier's position, and enemy snipers or gunners were quick to zero in on them. In addition, the M60 was a heavy weapon, and while it could put down a lot of fire, the sheer power of the machine gun made it difficult to move quickly or efficiently under fire. Whether they were providing cover for advancing troops, suppressing enemy positions, or defending a fixed location, M60 gunners faced constant exposure to enemy fire. They were highly visible targets, often forced to remain stationary for long periods, especially during firefights, all while their comrades took cover or attempted to maneuver. This meant that gunners were regularly under the threat of sniper fire, mortars, and grenades, all of which could end their life in an instant. But the fear of death was just one part of the experience. Physically, the job was nearly as punishing as it was dangerous. The M60 gunner had to carry the weapon, ammunition, and spare parts for days, sometimes weeks on end. In the humid, oppressive heat of the Vietnamese jungles, this was a brutal task. Soldiers regularly reported feeling exhausted, their muscles sore and their bodies drenched in sweat. The terrain itself was unforgiving. Thick jungle, steep hills, swamps, and muddy rice paddies made even simple movements a difficult and tiring effort. There were times when the M60 gunners were forced to fight in areas that were nearly impassable, and their role required them to press forward or hold positions that could leave them completely exposed. They had to walk for miles in swampy, flooded areas with the weight of the weapon and its ammunition on their backs, all while remaining alert for ambushes. As the days wore on, their exhaustion and fatigue mounted, but the pressure to keep the M60 firing, to maintain the firepower that could cover their unit's advance or retreat, was relentless. The constant presence of death also added to the psychological burden. M60 gunners not only had to stay alive themselves, but also bear the weight of being the linchpin in the unit's survival. They knew that if they failed to suppress enemy fire, their comrades would be left vulnerable. They were aware that a single misstep, an accidental lull in fire or a mechanical failure in the M60 could result in disaster for the whole squad. The pressure was immense, and while their comrades depended on them for cover, the gunners had little time or opportunity to seek cover for themselves. The psychological stress was unbearable at times, knowing that one of the most dangerous aspects of the job was that they were constantly under fire, often without any real place to hide. Every firefight could escalate into something far worse, and no one could predict what the next ambush would bring. The M60 machine gunner was often one of the first soldiers to engage the enemy, and this put them directly in harm's way. They were frequently the target of enemy snipers, mortars, and booby traps, all aimed at eliminating the gunner before they could suppress enemy fire. They were a key target because of the firepower they brought to the battlefield, making them the focal point for enemy attacks. This constant threat of being killed or wounded, combined with the responsibility of carrying and firing a weapon that was known for its power, weighed heavily on the gunners' minds. The sheer intensity of the battles, where they might engage in firefights for hours or days, left little time to rest or recover. Many soldiers reported the exhaustion as one of the worst parts of the job, both physical and mental. They knew that as long as they were alive, the fight would never stop. The terror of potentially running out of ammunition or of the weapon malfunctioning under pressure only added to the mental strain. One of the most brutal aspects of being an M60 gunner was the continuous risk of malfunctions. The M60, while reliable, was prone to jams, especially under the harsh conditions of the jungle. Mud, moisture, and dirt could easily clog the weapon, and the gunners had to constantly check for problems. When a jam occurred, it was not just a minor inconvenience, it could mean the difference between life and death. In the middle of a firefight, having a weapon malfunction could be disastrous. The gunner had to quickly clear the jam, sometimes while under fire, knowing that failure to do so could expose them to enemy retaliation. Despite these horrors, M60 gunners often formed deep bonds with their fellow soldiers, as their role required them to trust each other completely. The gunner depended on others to carry the ammunition, provide cover, and act as spotters, while the rest of the squad depended on the gunner for protection. This sense of camaraderie was one of the few things that helped them survive mentally, though it could not shield them from the constant danger and emotional toll of the job. Gunners often witnessed the deaths and injuries of their friends, and the psychological scars of the war lingered long after they returned home. The constant trauma, the sights and sounds of combat, the fear of death, and the responsibility for their comrades' safety created an emotional burden that many never truly escaped. In short, being an M60 machine gunner in Vietnam was not only physically demanding but also mentally and emotionally brutal. The constant exposure to danger, the never-ending fatigue, the fear of malfunction and failure, and the psychological toll of losing comrades and witnessing the horrors of war made it one of the most terrifying jobs in the conflict. Even the survivors were often left to cope with the profound trauma of their experiences, as the job demanded more than just skill with a weapon. It demanded a level of resilience that few could endure without lasting scars.